Do you have local taxes that need to be included on your W-2 forms? Well, I have good news for you. The process is now much easier and no longer requires complicated formulas. Watch this lesson to learn how easy it is now to prepare your system to print your local tax information on your W-2 forms. After participating in this lesson, you will be able to use the localities tax types function to create groups for local tax reporting on your W-2 forms. You will also learn how to print out copies that can be given to the employees and the local agencies that show the local tax information. In order for local tax information to be sent to Atrix and included on your W-2 forms, there are some preliminary steps you must take. This part of the lesson will show you what you need to do in order to get the system to display local tax information on your W-2 forms, and also we'll go through some different scenarios to help you determine how the information should be displayed on those forms. The first step in preparing your system to show local tax information on your W-2 forms is to go to Tasks, Federal, E-File, and Reporting. And now click on Link Atrix Tax Types. Use this window to indicate which local taxes should be grouped together for W-2 reporting. Start by assigning a group ID and a group description to help you identify what the tax group is and what its purpose is. Then indicate whether the group is active or not by selecting or not selecting the checkbox. Inactive groups are not sent to Atrix during the W-2 printing process. Then select the state the locality resides in. Next, select a tax description from the list. The list will vary depending upon the state selected above. If none of the choices in the list apply to the tax group you are setting up, select local withholding instead. The description selected here will appear on the W-2 form unless you chose local withholding, in which case you would enter the description you would like to print on your W-2 forms in the W-2 description field. Next, enter the employer ID that should display on the printed W-2 forms. And now decide how the Subject To amount for the taxes should be handled. If you are creating a group for a locality that has a single tax, this option does not apply. However, if you are creating a group for a locality that has multiple taxes, such as a resident and non-resident tax, then you must decide how to show the Subject To amounts. They can either be summed up, or you can have the system simply display whichever amount is higher. We will work through some scenarios later in this lesson using both options to help clarify what this choice will do. And finally, select the local tax or taxes that are being placed in the group in the list at the bottom of the screen. To add it to the list, simply select it in the left-hand side and then either double-click or use the right pointed arrow to move it to the list. Taxes listed under the Selected Tax Rates columns are those that are included in the group. And when done, click Save. Now that you have an idea of how the window works, let's take a look at a few common scenarios and how you would set up your groups to print the local information on the W-2 forms. The first scenario is the simplest. You have a locality that has a single tax associated and it needs to be printed in the local section on the W-2 form. In this example, we will use Beaverton as our locality and our employee number 104. As you can see from the Subject To report, this employee has a Subject To amount of $1,444.40, and the tax that was withheld is $3.61. Now we need to use the Link Atrix Tax Types function to create a group for this tax. Go to Tasks, Federal, E-File, and Reporting, and select Link Atrix Tax Types. To create a new group, click the asterisk in the top of the window, and then enter a group ID, followed by a group description. Select the state the local resides in from the list, then choose the tax description that best applies to this local tax. Remember that if none of the options in the list apply to what you're currently setting up, you can choose local withholding and then manually enter what description you would like on your W-2 forms for that tax. Next, enter your employer ID, And since local withholding was selected as the tax description, enter a W-2 description that will be used on the W-2 form. Had a tax description other than local withholding been selected, this field would be unavailable for editing. Now select the local tax you want to include on your W-2 forms, and then use the right arrow button to move it to the selected rates column. Click Save, then Yes, and now click Close. When the W-2 for this employee is printed, you will see the information for the local tax in boxes 18, 19, and 20, and you can see the Subject To and tax withheld amounts match the Subject To report you saw earlier. You may notice in the Action toolbar at the top of the screen that this is the Oregon W-2, or the state copy. The local taxes will display on this form, but this is not the form you send to the locality. We will cover printing the local copies a little later in the lesson. The employee's copy of the W-2 will also include this information in boxes 18, 19, and 20. So now that you have seen how it works when a locality has a single tax rate, you may be wondering about localities that have more than one tax, such as a resident and workplace rate. This is similar to a locality with a single tax in that we must create an matrix tax group. However, this time instead of just a single tax rate, we will have more than one. The following example will use employee 104 again, but this time the employee has earnings for two tax rates in a same locality, a resident tax and a workplace tax. In this example, the employee lived in this locality for part of the year, moved away, but continued to accrue wages in that locality, so some of the earnings are under the resident rate and the remaining earnings are under the workplace rate. The Subject To report shows the amount for both the resident and workplace tax. For the amounts of both of these taxes to print on the W-2 form, a group containing both tax rates must be created. In this case, the group ID is BVTN, and in the selected rates column, both the resident and workplace tax rates have been added. Now a decision must be made about how these taxes are reported. You can have the Subject To amounts for both taxes summed by selecting Sum All Subject To amounts, or you can have it report the higher of the two by selecting Use Highest Subject To amounts. If the option is left at Sum All Subject To amounts, when the W-2 is printed, the amounts for both taxes are shown in boxes 18, 19, and 20. In other words, box 18 shows the Subject To amount for both taxes, 19 shows the tax withheld for both taxes, and the W-2 description prints in box 20. And you can see on the employee copy the information shows the same way. Now if instead of using the option to sum all Subject To amounts, you choose to use the highest Subject To amount, the printed W-2 will show the amounts for the locality in boxes 18, 19, and 20. However, notice the Subject To amount is no longer a combined amount. Instead, it is just the higher of the two tax rates. The amount in box 19 is the combined amount for both taxes. The selection when setting up the group of taxes only applies to the amount that will print in box 18. Box 19 will always show the total of all taxes withheld for any taxes in the group specified. And you can see the information on the employee copy of the W-2 will appear the same way. But what if you wanted both amounts to show individually on the W-2 form instead of being combined into one line? Well, that leads us to our next scenario. If your locality has multiple tax rates, and on your W-2 form you need to report each tax individually, meaning the amounts for each tax rate would show on a separate line, the only difference would be to create a separate matrix tax group for each of the tax rates. The taxes will then report on separate lines in box 18, 19, and 20 when the W-2 form is printed. So going with the same example, our employee 104 was taxed for both the Beaverton workplace and resident taxes. To accomplish this, you will need two matrix tax groups, one like this for the workplace tax with just the tax ID BVTN, and another one like this for the resident tax, with just the tax rate BVTN_RES. When you print the W-2 form, you will see a line for each tax rate in boxes 18, 19, and 20 on the state copy, as well as on the copy for the employee. Please check with your tax advisor to determine whether Subject 2 amounts for the local taxes should be reported as a combined amount, or if just the higher amount needs to print, or if they need to be reported individually on separate lines. And now for the last scenario, where an employee may have been taxed in more than one locality. To prepare for this, you will need to create a group for each locality with the appropriate taxes in each group. The system will then group together the locals when the W-2 printing is started, and if the person was taxed in more than 2 locations, they will get extra copies of the W-2s. In this example, our employee 104 had both Beaverton taxes, but they also worked in and had wages subject to tax in both Portland and Tigard, as you can see on the Subject 2 report. The Beaverton tax group is set up and contains both the resident and workplace tax, and is set to sum all Subject 2 amounts. Click the List button and select the Tigard tax group. And you can see it is set up basically the same way with both a resident and workplace tax. And if you look at the tax group for the city of Portland, you can see that it is also set up with both a workplace and resident tax rate. Remember, this is just an example. Please remember to check with your tax advisor to determine which taxes should or should not be grouped together for W-2 purposes. Now, let's print the W-2s. You can see the Beaverton and Portland tax information listed in boxes 18, 19, and 20 on the first Oregon State W-2. And if you scroll down, the information for Tigard is included on a second W-2 for that employee. Notice all the other fields that would normally show tax information are blank. This is suppressed as that information is already included on the first copy for this employee. On the employee copy, the first page shows all the federal and state tax information, as well as the tax amounts for Beaverton and Portland in boxes 18, 19, and 20. If you click to the next page, you will see that a second W-2 is created for this employee with the additional locality information shown in boxes 18, 19, and 20. So now you've used the Link Atrix Tax Types function to create your local tax groups, and have seen how doing so will include the information for local taxes on your state-level W-2 copies, and the copies that are given to the employee. But how do you get copies to submit to the localities themselves? The next part of this lesson will show you how to print the copies to send to the local agencies. In this example, our employee 104 had both Beaverton taxes, but they also worked in and had wages subject to tax in both Portland and Tigard, as you can see on the Subject 2 report. Once you have finished printing your federal, state, and internal copies of the W-2 forms, the W-2 History File Options window appears. This is the starting point to print the local copies of the W-2 forms. If you've already closed out of this window, you can get back to it by going to Tasks, Federal E-File and Reporting, select Saved Reports, click Next, then choose your EIN in the list, and then click Open. Now select your W-2 and W-3 forms in the list, and when you click Edit, the W-2 History File window will reappear. In order to print your local W-2 copies, select Reprint Completed W-2s, and then click Next. Select the option Print Sorted Locality Copies. Then click Next again. Now select the states that the local taxes you wish to print W-2s for reside in. Click OK, and the W-2 forms will open in the Form Viewer. To print these, click the Next Step button in the top right corner of the window. Click Yes, and when ready, click OK to start printing. And don't worry, you don't have to memorize these steps. We've included the instructions on how to print the local level W-2s in the knowledge base. So to summarize the lesson, to report your local tax information, all you must do is use the Link Atrix Tax Types window to create groups for tax reporting on your W-2 forms. Please work with your tax advisor to determine which of the local taxes you are tracking can be combined on the W-2 form versus the ones that need to be shown individually. And for those being grouped, whether the Subject To amount should be summed or just reported based on the highest value. Remember, if more than 2 amounts need to be printed in boxes 18, 19, and 20, that multiple W-2 copies will be created. And finally, remember to choose the option to reprint completed W-2s when you have finished your state, federal, and internal copies, and follow the prompt to print sorted locality copies to produce the copies for the local agencies.